He was such a great. So for the last 15 years he attended Allison Park Church after he retired. And he would sit in the services where I was preaching, and he would come up to me afterward with tears in his eyes and say, "Pastor," he always called me Pastor, which I always thought was really awkward. And he would say, "Pastor, that's the greatest message I've ever heard in my life." And I'm like, "Dad, I know that's not true," but he meant it. He believed it. He was so encouraging, so kind, such a man of prayer. And when you have someone that's been incredibly valuable to you like that, and they're not present anymore, that's just a horrible feeling.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Allison Park Leadership Podcast, where we discuss the principles behind the plans. Glad you could join us today. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Dave.
And my name is Jeff, and we're really glad you're with us today. We appreciate all of your feedback, all of your comments, all of your shares. So my name's Jeff Leake. This is Dave Leake. Of course, I'm the lead pastor at Allison Park Church, and Dave's the campus pastor at our Northside campus. And I think this particular topic we're going to talk about today is a little bit more personal, or maybe I would say close to home for us, that we're going to talk about because of some recent events happening within our family. But I'll let you set the talk up, Dave.
Yeah, basically, we're going to be discussing how to keep moving forward in the middle of traumatic moments.
Yeah, as a leader, as a pastor, we endure the same kinds of trials, challenges, tragedies that everybody goes through. But when we endure them, we have to often continue to pastor, lead, and function in the midst of all of that. And that can be a little bit of a challenge, especially if you've never walked through that before as a pastor or a leader. So we're going to kind of walk through some learnings, I guess, from things that we're walking through personally right now.
Yeah. I think, didn't C.S. Lewis write a book on this? He wrote originally The Problem of Pain. Which is where he was describing the theoretical nature, and then it was a grief observed after his wife died, where he was actually in the middle of it. So basically for us recently, I guess a week and a half ago, your dad, my grandpa, passed away. And that was tough because he was a really amazing guy. And so I think for me, it kind of hit me all at once early on. And I know you were just saying even this past weekend, it finally sort of surfaced. And we've both kind of been in the middle of really, really busy seasons. There's never a convenient time for death, but this is a very, very not great time because you can't really take much to slow down. So I think this discussion might be a little bit of us just discussing how. So what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Like when something kind of hits. So
yeah. So let's describe this a little bit. So of course, my dad was 81 years old. He had been a pastor of Monroeville Assembly of God, which he kind of replanted back in 1965. He'd been there for 40 years, and then when he retired from being the lead pastor there, he and my mother started a missions organization called Acts 2024, which is based on his life verse. And they did a lot of missions work around the world, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, places like that. He had been sick for 3 years because he had a stroke that affected his left side, fell twice, broke both of his hips, had 2 hip replacements. Over the last year, he really deteriorated pretty quickly. So, we knew he was going to pass away. The hospice workers told us it's anywhere between a few weeks and a few months. He was at home, and in the middle of the night, on a Sunday morning, basically, my mom went and kissed him on the forehead and said, "I love you." Of course, he had been sort of in a medically induced coma there at home. But she said, "I love you," and then went back to bed, and then the buzzer went off to show that his oxygen had stopped, meaning that he had passed away. And that happened on a Sunday morning. So we were aware that it was happening. I think when somebody is sick for a long time or is older, you grieve a little differently because you're being prepared and you grieve all along. So because that was the case, he passed away Sunday morning. Both of us were scheduled to preach. We basically just showed up and preached that morning, and then there was services that were scheduled throughout that week in a revival week that we were having, and we participated in all of those. If it had been a sudden tragedy where all of a sudden someone had unexpectedly passed, I'm sure we would have figured a way to pass the ball to somebody else to handle it. There are certain moments where it's so traumatic and so unexpected and so shocking that to say, well, my wife just died in a car accident, but I'm going to preach anyway. I mean, there's certain moments where that would be irresponsible to just keep going. But because we were aware that at some point in the journey, my dad was going to pass from this life to the next, we just sort of kept moving through that first week and processed as we were going. So sometimes that's what you have to do. There's things that are happening in your personal life that you cannot push the pause button on everything in ministry to just step back and deal with some things. But I think for you, Dave, you're a little bit more, I think, emotive and a little bit more of an outward processor than I am. It hit you quicker, than it did me. The grief was coming up on you, I think, in the first few days, more than it was for me. And then for me, I was able to delay it somehow down the road.
Oh, I knew you were delaying it. You were like, I already processed through this. You were saying that. I've been processing this for months. And then all of a sudden, you got, tsunami'd for a second. Yeah. And I mean, I think that, so the reality is everybody deals with grief and trauma. Everybody deals with tragedy in some form or fashion. And it's tough. It reminds you of the frailty of life, and it reminds us of some good stuff, and it brings some stuff to the surface that we maybe don't want to always deal with. But I guess what I'm hoping from this conversation is just to be able to bring out some principles. I mean, we talk a lot about ministry principles, but today maybe just so how do you healthily process through something to the point of where you can make your peace with whatever tragedy is going on, or you can bear through it. You can be emotionally healthy without losing all momentum. Sometimes it feels like you're sort of destined for one of two dead ends. Either you're gonna let everything drop because you feel like you don't have what it takes and you're just gonna process, or you're gonna not process at all until you hit a wall eventually, because if you don't deal with trauma and grief, it will definitely come back up. It doesn't just go away. So I guess that's sort of the topic, and I would just love your thoughts. So this obviously isn't the first tragedy you've ever been through. I know you were saying, I forget who it was, but you were saying that a great leader once talked about how every 10 years of your life you face a major shifting point or tragedy or something difficult to deal with. So probably for almost everybody listening to this, either they've been through or are coming up on something they're going to have to process through and move through in terms of trauma. So, I guess I'll just pitch it like this. Like, what do you think the first steps are? What are some things that you've learned in your life experience, maybe even in this most recent one? How can we move forward in the midst of whatever trauma or grief someone's going through?
Yeah, so I think we'll start with this idea that the very first responsibility that any pastor or leader has is to pastor themselves. So you can't lead anybody else till you lead yourself. And part of the power that comes out of ministry is when you have taken the Word of God and received the grace of God, and you have applied it to your own soul in a moment of growth or trial or challenge or trauma. And then out of that experience of you ministering to yourself, or allowing yourself to receive ministry properly, we often teach others or lead others. So the hard work of working on our own soul, talking it through with a friend, getting prayer, getting counseling, taking some time to grieve, being in a place where we have allowed for God to heal us and restore us, that is not just does it position us to be able to be ready and available to serve and minister to others, because if we're broken and we're not healed in and of ourselves, we're eventually going to show the flaws of that in our ministry to other people. But it also then, it embeds in us certain concepts about how to minister to other people when they're going through different trials, losses, and traumatic moments in their life. So I think very first, it isn't a loss of momentum to pause and minister to yourself, because actually what you're doing is you're getting yourself back into a whole condition and preparing your heart to be able to be used to minister to others during their difficult time. So I don't think we see it as a detour. I think it's clearly on the path toward what we do all the time. But what seems like a detour is that we have to put off certain activities and events to be able to have the space to process. So I think we have to start there with that concept, that idea, and the recognition that we are not the Messiah, that we may lead our churches or ministries or departments or businesses, But really, our life is in the hands of God, and anything that happens in our life is because of His grace. And so it's okay to take your hands off for a minute of the steering wheel and let Him drive, because ultimately it's not up to you anyway. And so you can trust Him and the people around you to help guide you through moments like this. So I think that's a good starting place. You're not the Messiah. You need help. As you receive help well, you're able to give it to others because you receive grace. You can distribute that grace, and I think that's a good starting spot.
Yeah. So how do you do this? Like, what is your...
So we're very different, right? You are external processor. I'm an internal processor. When you go through it, let me just start with you. When you go through something in your life, you need to talk it through, don't you? Right?
Yeah.
Isn't that how you process?
Yeah, most things.
Okay, so describe that. When you started to feel the grief coming up on you, it feels a little bit like, I always say, like an emotional vomit moment. You just feel like blah on the inside, and it starts to bubble up inside, and you just feel like maybe you're going to cry, or you just feel disgusting. You just feel like, this is depressed. You wonder, what's wrong with me? Why do I feel like this? And it's because this God-given emotion of grief is starting to work. It's like breaking a bone. It's sore to the touch. If you break your leg and you put weight on it, it's sore to the touch. That's a part of the healing process. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just a part of what it is to grieve. But when you started to feel that inside, what's the steps that you take, Dave? How do you process?
Well, if we're using this most recent one as an example, Jonathan, my little brother, who's managing our podcast right now, actually. Can't
Shout
see
out
him.
to Jonathan Lee. Come on, everybody, chant Hoj. There you go.
That's his nickname. But he was playing the drums, so we had a chance to sneak out a little bit early from church. We went to Starbucks, and I don't even know if Hoj was ready to process at all.
Did you force them to?
Yeah. Well, I was like, so we have that moment at the beginning of our worship service where it's like, the prayer for the one where you pray for a specific need. And I think Brian had thought I wasn't going to be there, which I didn't care either way. But so both times there was just a lot of attention and focus, and me,
because they were praying for you as prayer for the one?
Yes.
Okay.
For our family.
Yeah.
And so I was processing it a little faster, I think, than you were. It's not like I was numb to it. And I was just running out of things to say. Like, thanks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, sorry for your loss. Okay, yeah. Well, we knew it was coming for a little bit. But there's not that many responses you can say when you're feeling pain. So me and Hoj just kind of went to Starbucks and talked for a little while, and that helped. I think for me, I don't cry that much. Pretty rare. But if I ever feel like I could, over this kind of grief stuff, I typically try to allow myself to fully feel, because I know that I tend to detach from stuff and to bury it for a while. But yeah, so I think what I did is I probably just, for several days, I was fine, but I took a little bit of extra space, and we hung out with family that night, got around my brothers and sisters, and talked about some stories with some people. I saw my therapist that week, and it was hard. It was a hard week. I still feel like I'm a little emotionally raw from all of it. It's not present all the time in my mind, but I was cranky last night. You know what I mean? And I think a part of that is from grief. So I guess my other part of it for me is just being aware. It's like self-awareness. I'm not naturally emotionally in tune with myself, so I want to be able to express it, to talk it out, and to try to get some self-awareness about how I'm feeling, because my tendency is to just not deal with it. So that feels like it's my step.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so I think for me, my process is I need some time in solitude. So I look at 1 King chapter 19, where Elijah was exhausted, and he ends up running to Mount Horeb, and he enters a cave, and he unloads, and he says, I feel like I'm the only one out here, and they're getting ready to kill me, and I just want to quit. I just want to die. And he unpacks it to God, and then God speaks to him in the midst of that moment. For me, that's what I have to do. I have to get alone. And I've got to often write in my journal. Sometimes I need to sleep. I need to not be around people where there's anything expected of me, so that I don't have to give at all. I can just simply be. And then after I do that, I need to be around the people who are also grieving. So, I've spent some time with my mom, taking her around to different places, doctor's appointments and shopping and things like that. And during the travel, we'll discuss some memories. I also have been, so my dad was such an amazing pastor, leader, father, communicator, Bible teacher. So I've been listening to some of his messages that he preached in the past. And as I hear his voice, there's a couple of things. First, I'm even more grateful for who he is, who he was. But then I come face to face with the idea I'm not going to hear that voice again. Like, until I get to heaven and see him in heaven, I'm never going to hear that voice again. And I think that's that closure moment, that finality sets in. You think, wow, this is rough. Like, I will never hear him preach again. I'll never sit across from him and have a conversation like we used to have a conversation about what God's doing in the world. Or, he was such a great, so for the last 15 years, he attended Allison Park Church after he retired. And he would sit in the services where I was preaching, and he would come up to me afterward with tears in his eyes and say, Pastor. He always called me Pastor, which I always thought was really awkward. And he would say, Pastor, that's the greatest message I've ever heard in my life. And I'm like, Dad, I know that's not true, but he meant it. He believed it. He was so encouraging, so kind, such a man of prayer. And when you have someone that's been incredibly valuable to you like that, and they're not present anymore, that's just a horrible feeling. And yet at the same time, you're grateful because he was such a great guy that you have someone to miss. Because, some people are not that way. They didn't live a life of encouragement or blessing to others. And so the loss is felt a little less profoundly. But when you have an amazing human being, like my dad has been to us, you feel it in a really profound way. So for me, getting alone, journaling, praying it through, and then being with people, I think is a part of it. And just allowing yourself the chance to be is a part of the journey too.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing that you were saying that begins at the beginning of the journey is kind of allowing yourself to process it through. Like, you got to pass through yourself first through tragedy.
Yeah.
Which, easier said than done, and I think some of it takes time. But it's the first step. But that alone probably isn't enough to kind of keep moving. I think a lot of times you can get stuck. Yeah. So how do you what else do you do to keep moving forward in the midst of trauma?
Yeah. So I forget what her first name is, but there's a psychologist by the name of Kubler-Ross who came up with the various stages of grief and talks about there's 5 of them. The first one is denial, where you're like, this can't be happening to me. Then anger, I'm really angry that this is happening to me. And then bargaining, maybe if I had done something different, this wouldn't be happening to me. Then depression, I can't believe this just happened to me, right?
Yeah.
And then acceptance eventually. And I think the process of healing, God's given us the gift of grief, because these emotions are a part of bringing our soul back into full form. And we can't resent any of these emotions. And they are not indicators that anything's broken within us permanently. They're just the reality of what we have experienced showing up within our soul. And as long as we don't get stuck in one of them, like if we stay perpetually in denial or constantly angry or not coming out of depression, then that becomes a significant problem. But just being self-aware that that's going on and making sure that we are constantly taking the time we need to be healthy inside. Again, that doesn't mean that you get the chance to stop. So there's been a couple of other occasions in my life that I'll point to now. So this is now a little over 9 years ago, where a pastor on the staff at Allison Park Church, who was so well loved, and one of my best friends, Bruce Edwards, he was in Delaware. He was swimming in the ocean. He got knocked over by a wave. He, broke his neck, ended up on the shore. They revived him, but he was in a coma, basically brain dead for 10 days. And then eventually he passed away. So I was driving back and forth to Philadelphia to be with Bruce's family, who was part of Allison Park Church. Then I was helping Allison Park Church process the grief of losing one of the pastoral staff, and he was so loved by so many people. So I was having to pastor everyone through the loss of Bruce while I was grieving the loss of Bruce. And honestly, I had to, for a little bit, put off my grief. I know you can't totally do that. Like, you can't just say, oh, grief, go away. I will not deal with you. But I had to sort of push it down for a minute so that when I stood in front of everybody and I addressed, why did this happen? What are we learning from this? How do we depend on God in these moments? That I wasn't like a blubbering fool in front of the whole room. Like, I had to have some presence of mind to be able to keep it together to minister to people. And, I think you see this in so many different, like a general on the battlefield has to keep his wits about him in the middle of the war, even though people are dying around him. So I think you just have to somehow keep your focus. And so this moment, this accident happened at the end of September. I ministered through that time, October, November, December, January, and really hadn't faced grief myself. And I just kind of almost assumed, like, I think I must, okay, everything I was telling everybody else from the pulpit as I was leading through the funeral and the memorial service and the prayer meetings that we had must have been working for me too, that I think I must be past this. And then all of a sudden, like a volcano in my soul, one day it just erupted on me. And I just felt like I was emotionally dead. So I called the phone and called on the phone to Pastor Cullen Allen, who was the executive pastor at that time. And I said, I will not be in for several weeks. I can't function. Like, I hit a wall, and it was like the grief in me said, you will deal with this.
Yeah.
And so I had to take, a couple of weeks off and, process what I was experiencing and talk to someone about what I was going through, because eventually, if you can suppress it for a minute. Like, my dad died on Sunday morning at 3:30. I went over to see my mom at 7 o'clock in the morning. The funeral director showed up and took the body from the house. We prayed together. We wept together. I got in the car. I went to church and I preached 2 services, and I could handle that. I was able to suppress my emotions for a moment and get through that service. And I did that for several more days. But eventually, it will catch up with you if you don't process what's happening in your life. And so you have to, so since you're the leader, no one will carve out the time for you to process for you except you, which means that you have to strategically look at your life and say, this is when I will, because if you don't, it will just eventually erupt on you.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the learning. I should have taken that time way before February when I talked about the Bruce situation.
Sure.
I just was unaware of how much it had affected my soul.
Yeah. You mentioned the 5 stages of grief. I almost think that there's a different way you gotta keep moving forward, or different things to guard against in each one of those stages.
Yeah.
So maybe we could spend some time just even talking through, as you're going through grief or trauma and you're hitting those different phases, what you kind of need to be thinking about or protecting yourself from, right? So the first one was anger.
The first one is denial.
Denial first.
And denial, I think, part of the reason why we show up at a funeral home and we have a viewing is for closure's sake. We can look at a body and say, they really are gone. This is really happening. This is what's happening as I'm listening to my dad's preaching. It's like, I won't hear this voice again. As painful as it is to hear him preach and face the fact that I'm not going to hear him, that's important for me so that I don't stay stuck in denial. It's a part of the closure process. When it comes to anger, anger can be directed in so many different directions. Anger at them for leaving. Sometimes people feel that. I can't believe you left me, even though it's not their fault. Anger at ourselves for maybe I wish I had said something more or done something more. Sometimes we can be angry at God for taking them away. And so I think it's good to be able to just admit, I'm angry, even to tell God, I'm angry with you. I don't understand why you did this or why you allowed this. God can handle it. And so admitting to yourself, that you're angry and who you're angry at, and then coming to the right perspective so that you're not living in a lie,
I think that one's good to pause on, because I think anger can jut out in so many different ways. Like I'll just say for me, I'm usually a very even-keeled person, and I don't get angry super easily. But I just feel like I've been in phases, not constantly, but phases here and there where it's like I just know I'm in a bad mood right now.
Yeah, you're cranky, right?
Yeah. And I could blow up on someone if I'm not careful. So I think that's one of the biggest safeguards for me is I have to try to be more humble to admit that this person doesn't deserve what I feel like they deserve.
Yeah, and to announce it, sometimes you say, by the way, if I'm a little cranky, it has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And if I say something, please forgive me in advance. I'm going to do my best, but I appreciate your grace. Most people understand that.
Yeah, and then I think your family is the one you have to protect the most.
Yeah.
Because they're the one that are going to get struck by lightning from you all the time,
Right.
For doing stupid stuff that doesn't,
true.
you would never normally think of.
Yeah. Or here's another one. And this was one of the things I should have recognized before the volcano erupted on me, like I said, in February, and I called Cullen to say, take over for a bit. I had sent several angry emails to staff members. And I was not recognizing that I had become electronically cranky. So, and I go back and read those emails, like, wow, what was wrong with you? Well, you were mad, but not at them. It just became, every little offense became a massive offense because you hadn't processed the grief inside. Mm-hmm. And so I had to go back and make up some apologies because I was operating unhealthily.
Yeah, and I mean, it sucks that you have to go through that and feel that anger, but I just think like it's healthy to recognize I am angry for a lot of reasons related to grief, and I have to protect those that I could most easily blow up on. Right. That's probably a healthy. Otherwise, you could burn some bridges.
Yeah.
Because of your grief that are really hard to put back together. So
the third phase is bargaining, and this is where we try to make deals. If I could have done something different, or, God, maybe you could bring them back. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense, but this is a part of it. But I think the recognition that comes with this particular phase of grief is the awareness that we are not in control of our lives, that we have no control over how long we live or how long the people around us live or whether or not bad things happen. And that's a feeling of really being exposed.
Oh, this is the phase when it's saying you're like, I wish I could blank,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could just, trade places with them. I wish I could,
And so the recognition of the loss of control, because if this bad thing happened, how can I make sure that nothing like this ever happens to me again? And you realize you don't have that ability. And so this is where you have to figure out how to lean on the sovereign care of a good Father, and to say, God, I know that I'm in this world, and death is a part of the journey, and until we get to heaven, pain is a part of the journey, and I can't protect myself. If I go around trying to protect myself from every bad thing that could happen, I'll be an emotional cripple. So I can't do that. But at the same time, I know I can't, by analysis, worry, fear, control my environments. So I have to do my life in a constant dependence on you, and that's healthy to recognize that. That brings the humility when you realize that you really can't control anything. I mean, even our heart beating is in God's control, or the breath we take is in God's control. So, but putting ourselves in that position is a really healthy thing.
Yeah, it's funny to talk about this because I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm processing this right now. So I'm like, oh, that's when I was bargaining. Like you know what I mean? Whenever I'm just like thinking through my own recent emotions. Yeah, that's wild. Okay, and then we have depression.
And depression is just that recognition that this sucks. Right? This is awful. I just lost my friend Bruce. I just lost my dad. For someone maybe, I just lost a job, or my marriage broke up, or I got fired from this ministry role, or God moved me and I didn't want to leave that place. And there's all kinds of reasons why people grieve. The death of a dream, the death of a relationship. And depression comes when you just realize how bad it really is. I'll bring up the other moment, so we have 5 amazing grandkids. And in the process of the birth of these grandkids, 2 of our kids, your sister Alyssa and your brother Josh, both lost children. Josh and Allison had a baby that was stillborn, and Alyssa and Alyssa was carrying a baby. There were twins, and one of them didn't make it all the way to term. So the loss of 2 grandchildren, I don't remember which of the 2 that it was when it happened. And again, for a little while, I think I was just numb. I was in denial. I don't remember going through a lot of anger. I don't even know why. that I didn't go through a lot of anger. But at some point, the depression hit. And I remember the moment it hit. I was, we were running, my wife and I running around North Park, which is a 5-mile run. We were doing our workout for the day, and I had gone about 1.5 miles, and all of a sudden, in the expense of energy that was going on, I just started to sob. Like, I wasn't even thinking about Nora or Jovi, whichever one it was that passed. But it just kind of, like a volcano came up on me, and I started sobbing. So I had to stop running, and I laid down in the grass and just sobbed for about 10 minutes. And then I walked back to my car and drove home. And
was there anybody walking by you?
I don't remember. I don't think I cared. Yeah. At that particular moment, I was just violently grieving. So I had to cancel some things. We went away for a couple of days. And it was just really a sad season. It was just so, to see your son standing there holding his baby that isn't alive. I mean, that is just one of those moments I'll never forget in my life. And but we do believe in a God who is a God of resurrection. I believe one day I'm going to see Jovi and Nora. We grieve, but not as people who have no hope. So eventually the depression has to give way to hope, because we know that the pain we're in, the loss that we're in, this is not the final moment. I'm going to see my dad again. In fact, my dad, before he passed, was talking about, even the last couple of weeks when he was able to talk about, he was talking about his dad, who one day he's going to see, or my mom's dad, Grandpa Campanella, and then all of his siblings are up there. I know one day I'm going to see him. I know that everything my dad did in this life, he did with such a pastor's heart, and he loved so many people. And so many people have said, wow, if it wasn't for your dad, I wouldn't be saved, or we wouldn't be married, or whatever it happens to be. And he's going to get in. I know he's entered into heaven. He's receiving his reward. And what an amazing thing. So the depression has to give way to good theological thinking, which is that there is hope, that this is not the end. It is an end, and it's an end that just is totally heartbreaking. Yeah. But it isn't the end. And so because there is hope that comes. And that's what brings us, I think, into finally accepting where we are.
But let's sink back into depression for a second.
Before we don't want to leave depression too soon.
Let's not brush the grief. No, but I think, so let's talk about how you deal with the depression, and how what are the dangers of it, and how do you get to that place? Because it's not, we all know, if we believe in Jesus, that there is a hope, but knowledge is different than actually the acceptance of that knowledge that brings you out of the depression phase. So I guess first of all, what are the dangers or challenges of this that you've experienced when it comes to that depression part?
Well, it becomes like a pit that you sink down into, and you just live there. And then you start to believe a lot of things that aren't totally true, and you end up with this ache in the side that becomes infected, and it irradiates, and then you become miserable to be around, and it's really hard to function. That's why I think there's a couple things in the midst of depression, and that depression that we do that helps us. One is, like you did, Dave, you talked to your therapist. So what did that conversation go like that helped you deal with the sadness?
That was a hard conversation.
Yeah.
Because he just he kept asking me questions that were making me cry, and I was like, oh. But that's crying is part of healing. A lot of people say, I shouldn't be crying. I know that he was a good guy. I'm going to see. No, you should be crying. Sure, even sometimes people will come back a year after the fact that they lost their loved one, and they come in for a Christmas Eve service, and they say, I can't come into this church without remembering that my dad was here with us last year, and it just makes me want to cry. And I say, well, cry. That's actually good for you to face the fact that he's not here, to remember how wonderful it was to celebrate Christmas Eves with him, and to let it go. Like, it's okay to sob. It's okay to cry. There's nothing unhealthy about that. And so the counselor was probably triggering you on purpose. Yeah, I'm sure he was. Yeah. So he was discussing, and he was saying, so I'm the firstborn of our family, and of all the grandkids as well. And he was just like, well, it's different for you probably. So he was just asking me, like, what do you remember about him, and what are lessons that he taught you? And I was like, oh, I just kept getting stopped in the middle of it. I was like, so that was one of the things he was like, you you want to talk about this with your dad or your grandma, and spend time with family, and take a minute to write down some of the things that you remember that he imparted to you that you can now kind of carry on. So those were all helpful.
Yeah. I think another thing in the depression season is this, to sing or even to just listen to songs that reflect the choice of healing. So, it is well with my soul. It is well. It's not that it's okay. It's just declaring it's going to be okay because my life is in the hands of God. I remember during the era with Pastor Bruce when he passed, there was a song that we were singing at that time that said, "Oh no, you'll never let go. You'll never let go of me." And that song was sort of an anthem during that time. We sang it over and over during our services because, it starts by talking about the 23rd Psalm, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Familiar songs and familiar psalms from the scripture and verses are a part of what ministers to us because songs and psalms are emotive. They bring it out of us. And so sometimes it's the singing, it's the talking it through, it's the remembering and listening to the words of the scripture that minister to our soul, that bring us back to a place where what is true, that there is a hope in Christ, becomes something that roots within us that we really are experiencing.
Yeah. Okay. So then we finally get to that place of acceptance.
Yep.
And so, obviously, there is an act of acceptance. I don't think that it's just that the grief is over. It's the fifth stage of grief where you actually are still contending with the loss. So what does acceptance look like?
Acceptance is where you start to move forward and you realize it's okay to be not okay completely, and yet to function in your life with this new reality. So you start to laugh again, and you start to do the pastimes that you enjoy again, and you start to live your life without guilt that you're moving on from that moment. Because a lot of times people feel like, well, if I move on from this moment, then I'm forgetting them. No, you're not. You're just living your life. But there will be moments, the next time you celebrate Thanksgiving, the next time his birthday or her birthday comes around, the next time the anniversary of your divorce pops up, the next time you celebrate Christmas, the next time you smell something in the air that reminds you of him or her, that all of that grief starts over again, and you go right back into it. And if that happens to you, where you're remembering the loss, and you go back through the denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance, it doesn't mean anything's broken in you. It's just part of what God has built into us to help us heal. And so if you find yourself needing to take a personal day, because around a holiday or birthday or a memorable experience, you have to process again, that should be expected. And again, as a pastor leader, you're taking responsibility for administering to your own soul. But then all of these life lessons should sensitize us to the fact that every day when we stand up and lead worship, or we step up and preach, there are people in our audience that are having a hard time concentrating on anything we're saying or doing because they're stuck in the middle of their own pain. And so when you preach, this is something that should inform our preaching ministry. When we preach, we should be aiming towards people's pain and recognizing that sometimes sermons come off like platitudes, like, yeah, that sounds really great, but I'm not sure how that would work in this situation. When you walk through pain yourself, that sensitizes you to the people you're trying to minister to all along. And I think it makes us better at what we do.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember my grandpa Campanella, when he was getting ready to die. So little background, my grandpa was a short Italian man. He was brought over from Italy with his family when he was 4 years old. He was really quiet. He whispered. He very rarely talked. I don't ever remember my grandpa crying. He rarely laughed. He was just always sort of in his own world, focused. He was a wonderful man, a godly man. I knew he loved me, but he was not highly conversational. So the longest conversation I think I ever had with my grandpa was when he was dying. He had a cancer that was pressing on the back of his neck, and they had to do surgery to take the tumor out, and they put him in one of those halo things that locks your neck in place. And so he was in the hospital with one of those things on for several weeks, and he had gone through so much. And I was sitting by his bedside, and he said to me, "Jeffrey, you're going into ministry." And he said, "I never realized what it's like to suffer And he said, but honestly, these last few months have been horrible. And then with tears in his eyes, he said to me, don't forget those who are suffering. In your ministry, make sure you pay attention to people suffering. And a couple of weeks later, he passed away. And that always stuck with me, that, okay, the suffering I'm experiencing today is maybe minuscule in comparison with what other people are going through in their life. And the pain that I'm enduring and that volcano that erupts in me, the people I'm ministering to, singing to, preaching to, caring for, mobilizing to serve, a lot of times they're carrying around this volcano of pain inside them as they're functioning. And as we mature and grow as pastors and leaders, we need to be aware that this is a lot of our congregation. They're dealing with these very same emotions. So it should help us to be better at how we function in that way.
That's really good. Yeah. Any closing final thoughts for those who are suffering or who are going through trauma right now?
Yeah, just know that you're not weird. Nothing's broken in you. I mean, yes, temporarily, but grief is a normal thing. Don't be too hard on yourself. Don't put yourself down. Just give yourself the time and space to process so that you can come out on the other side in acceptance.
Absolutely.
And I think we should dedicate this episode to James Leake.
Yeah.
My dad, Dave's grandpa, who was an amazing, incredible father. I always say, if I don't do something with my life with the parents that I had, I'm going to have to give an account to God, because I grew up in an incredible home with a mother and father who loved each other and loved me and were encouraging. My dad knew the Bible probably better than anybody I know. He would pull nuggets out of certain passages, and I'd be like, I never saw that before. He was truly, truly a man of God, and he will be greatly missed. And I just pray that I live into that legacy. I don't think you can live up to it, but you can live into it. So I pray that I live into that legacy.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah, personal to me too. Yeah, so we'll dedicate it to James Leake. But we hope you got something out of this, because this is healthy for us to do too. You know what I mean? But hopefully, this can help you process through whatever you're going through or whatever you will go through. And as always, we would appreciate it if you wouldn't mind sharing this resource with anybody else that you think might benefit from this. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, social media, etc. So if you could like and subscribe and share it, that would be incredible. So yeah, thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time.